Hey boys, it's HarmNone. Today we're going to be going over 10 really good drift cars in Grand Theft Auto Online. Now obviously drift cars, you can't really say for a fact that like one car is better than the other. There's definitely some cars that are better than others, but there's some cars that are based on opinions. So I'm going to give you my opinion today. These are some of the best drift cars in Grand Theft Auto Online. Let's get into it. We're going to start off with number 10. Alright guys, starting off with number 10, we have the True Fate Adder. Now before you tweak out and say, it's not a drift car, it power slides, or like start crying, whatever, you know, I know there's going to be probably some people that are going to cry about it, because the drift community has got a lot of really sensitive people in it, so we have to be really careful about our feelings with drift cars. So yeah, the Adder is it's four-wheel drive, it power slides. It's not necessarily drifting, it's power sliding. Shut up, I don't care. Now the Adder is, well, it's actually my favorite car in Grand Theft Auto Online. The Adder does have quite an ability to drift, I do find, or power slide. I'm just gonna call it drifting, but when I say drift, just substitute power sliding in, because that's, you know, what it's doing. But the Adder is super controllable, obviously due to the fact that it's all-wheel drive. It definitely helps to make this vehicle a little bit more controllable than most when you're drifting it through corners. Power slide, whatever, shut up. The Adder comes in at $1 million. It's basically the OG, like really expensive car in Grand Theft Auto Online, but I gotta say it is pretty good for drifting. It's not the best ever, don't get me wrong. That's why I put it at number 10, because I know, like I said, the drift community is very sensitive, so it's at number 10. It's just a personal pick that I like to drive when I'm trying to do some drifting and stuff like that. Overall, probably the reason that the Adder's on this list is just because I like the Adder and I manage to drift it semi-well sometimes, although in this footage I'm sure that my drifting is not exactly coming across very strongly with the Adder, but on occasion you can hit a pretty nice line with this thing. Anyway guys, that's it for number 10. Let's move on to number 9. Alright guys, at number 9 we have the Ocelot Lynx. Now the Lynx is a car that gets kind of trashed on in GTA quite often, because it does come in at about $1.8 million, which is pretty expensive. However, it is pretty decent at drifting, I have personally found. And I've also heard a lot of other people talking about the Lynx. It's a very capable drift car. It's one of the very few things that the Lynx is actually good at. It is very controllable a lot of the time, and it's pretty easy to keep the front end exactly where you want to with this car. The front end always comes around exactly where you want it, and it doesn't really ever allow the back end of the car to spin out too much. Overall, the Lynx is probably a pretty good drift car to get started with in GTA. I do like how this thing handles a lot, and it's definitely a pretty underrated car for drifting in my opinion. You need to have a decent amount of speed with this thing to actually get it to drift properly, or double clutch it. That will actually get the wheels to spin and make things a little bit easier for you. But the Lynx is a pretty good drift car to get started with. If you've never really drifted before in GTA, you can usually get some pretty good lines going with this thing. It really helps if you stance the wheels. I didn't bother to do that for this video, but that is how you make a car drift a little bit better in GTA. So if you're really trying to get into drifting, you're going to want to stance the wheels on all of these cars. Anyway guys, that is pretty much it for number 9. Let's move on to number 8. Alright guys, next up we have the Dubachi 770. Now this is another car that's not exactly super common for drifting, but I have found some success with this car myself. Now again, similar to the Lynx, I have not bothered to stance the wheels for this video, but if you do want this thing to drift really well, you will probably need to stance the wheels. However, with that being said, the front end of this car does feel pretty heavy, and the back end of the car feels very light, which is definitely kind of what you want for drifting. It makes the back end come around a little bit easier, which obviously allows you to drift a little bit better. Now the 770 is the cheapest car on the list so far, coming in at $695,000, which is a pretty fair price, especially considering the car's performance is pretty good overall, and of course it does have the ability to drift. And I would definitely say that the 770 is better at drifting than the previous two cars that we've put on the list. Definitely not going to be the best car on the entire list, but it is an improvement over the first two vehicles. The 770 is a car that I would recommend picking up regardless of if you really want to drift or not. It's just a fantastic car, and I feel like everyone should own one. Anyway guys, that is pretty much it for the 770. Let's move on to number 7. Alright guys, next up we have the ENUS ZR350, coming in at $1.6 million, which is pretty expensive. This is the first Tuners DLC vehicle that we have on the list though, so of course this thing does have the ability to lower the stance, which will allow you to drift this thing a little bit easier. Now, this vehicle has low grip tires on it, which definitely allows you to drift a little bit easier than some of the other cars that we've gone over on this list already. Now, I personally don't love how low grips make a car handle. I feel like it's like pretty much impossible to drive with them, especially with it being stanced as well. You get like absolutely zero grip, but it does allow you to drift at lower speeds, which is pretty nice. Now, even without low grip tires on the ZR350, it is a pretty good drift car in my opinion. I really do like how this thing handles. Obviously, the Tuners DLC vehicles have been nerfed since they came out originally with the Tuners DLC, which is a real shame. I wish that Rockstar didn't do that, but I guess felt like they had to for some reason. Quite unfortunate, but the ZR350 still does handle relatively well for being a drift car in GTA. Definitely one that I'd recommend trying out, especially if you guys have one already. There's no harm in putting some low grips on it and just, you know, going and sending it around a little bit. Overall, the ZR350 is one of my favorite cars from the Tuners DLC. It's definitely a good one to own regardless of if you want to drift or not. Anyway guys, that is pretty much it for the ZR350. Let's move on to number 6. Alright guys, next up we have the Albany VSTR at number 6. The VSTR comes in at nearly $1.3 million. And for that price, you do get a really good drift car and a really good 4-door drift car. In my opinion, the VSTR might just be the best 4-door drift car in the entire game. Now you can argue about that with me in the comments down below. I'm not even going to bother arguing about it, but that is something that I truly kind of feel might be the truth. The VSTR is a fantastic drift car. Now, I think a large part of why the VSTR is so good at drifting is because this car is very easy to double clutch, if you will. That's where you spam the handbrake and you will get like a huge amount of power that all of a sudden gets sent to the rear wheels with this car, allowing the back end to obviously slide around quite a bit, quite easily. Now the VSTR is also a very easy to control car when you are drifting. I personally love the handling of the VSTR in general. It handles great, and if you pop the handbrake then you're going to start drifting, and it handles so well. VSTR is definitely a great car to have in GTA, and especially for only $1.3 million, it's really not that expensive. You get a great looking car and you get a great performing car, drifting and just driving in general. Overall, the VSTR is a car that I would highly recommend picking up. With that being said, let's move on to number 5. Alright guys, next up we have the Benefactor Schlagen GT coming in at $1.3 million. This is a very solid car in GTA and one of the better drift cars in the entire game. Now the only reason that this thing's at number 5 is because there's just a few more cars in the game that are just even a little bit better at drifting than this thing is, which is pretty crazy considering the Schlagen GT is one of my favorite drift cars in GTA. Now, what I said about the Albany VSTR being really easy to double clutch, that is even more true with the Schlagen GT. You can double clutch this thing so easily. You just spam the handbrake and you can get the back end of this thing to just get an extreme amount of power, and it makes drifting very simple. I'd say the Schlagen GT is one of the easiest cars to learn how to drift with in GTA, simply because of the double clutching ability that it has. It's super easy. You can get the tail end to spin out. Almost easier than any other car in the game. I mean, except for a couple of the ones that are coming up ahead here. But the thing that I like about the Schlagen GT is unless you press the handbrake, you can't really get the back end of this car to spin out very easily unless you're doing some crazy cornering where you go back and forth over and over again, switching directions. The car is going to handle really well by itself, but if you do want it to drift, you can make it drift quite easily. Overall, Schlagen GT, definitely a car that I would recommend picking up if you guys don't have one already. Such a great car. Tons of customization, really fast. There's nothing wrong with this thing, boys. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Alright guys, at number 4 we have the Karen Futo GTX. Yes, I'm actually saying something positive about the Karen Futo GTX. I know that's pretty unheard of for me. Now, the Futo GTX, it is good at one thing, and that one thing is drifting, of course. This thing, even when it is fully upgraded, is still just piss slow. Besides that, it is very good at drifting. Now, the car has almost no power. I feel like the car actually has about 4 horsepower, maybe. So getting this thing up to speed to go around a corner is going to be a bit of a challenge, but when you actually get to the corner, the car does slide pretty nicely, I gotta say. Now, it's not the best thing ever, in my opinion. I feel like there's cars that are more fun to drift. Even the Schlagen GT, I feel like, is a car that's more fun to drift than the Futo GTX, but maybe that's just because I hate this thing, and yes, I know I just made the JDM guys very sensitive and upset, and the drift guys too. But I must say that the Futo GTX still does drift very, very nicely. All you have to do is pop the handbrake like literally once and you're sliding, and it is very, very controllable. So if you're just learning how to drift, this is another really good option for you. However, the one problem with this car is that it does come in at $1.2 million, which I feel like is an extreme amount of money for a Corolla. Can't necessarily say I recommend this if you're just starting drifting in GTA, or if you don't have a lot of money. But if you do have a lot of money and maybe you're not starting out, then, you know, the Futo GTX could be okay for you. Anyway, I'm done talking about this thing. Let's move on to number 3. Alright guys, at number 3 we have the Dubachi Rapid GT coming in at about $130,000, which is pretty cheap, all things considered, on this list so far. Now the Rapid GT, I don't personally love the handling of this car. It understeers a lot. Once you start involving the handbrake in your driving, the Rapid GT becomes one of the best drift cars in the entire game. If you stance this thing as well, it's also very, very nice to drift. It is quite a manageable vehicle, and for only $130,000, the Rapid GT is super, super solid for drifting. In my opinion, this car is a lot more fun to drift than the KIM Futo GTX because you get a little bit more speed going into the corner, and you also have a little bit more power as well, so makes it a little easier to slide around the corner. But maybe that's because I'm just not a pro expert JDM drift master, so I don't know. You guys tell me in the comments down below. Probably something like that. The Rapid GT also, in my opinion, is a much better looking car than the KIM Futo GTX, so if you're, you know, into driving cars that don't look terrible, then the Rapid GT might be for you. This car is also pretty easy to double clutch, which allows it to drift a little bit easier than some of the other cars on this list, a little bit, you know, a little bit higher up, like the Lynx and stuff like that. Overall, the Rapid GT is a pretty good vehicle. I would definitely recommend giving it a shot for sure. Anyway guys, let's move on to number 2. Alright guys, next up we have the KIM Futo. Now the KIM Futo comes in at a whopping $9,000, or of course you can just steal it off of the street, which is what I would recommend. But the KIM Futo is regarded as the best drift car in Grand Theft Auto Online by a lot of the drifting community. This car is relatively easy to double clutch. The back end does not grip up very well either, so it's kind of a good recipe for drifting. Now on the keyboard, I personally find this car a little bit hard to drift, but that might just be because I'm not a pro expert JDM drift god master or something, I don't know. But I gotta say, it is a pretty fun car to drive. When you yank the handbrake on this car, the back end comes around like extremely fast, so it's very easy to get some good angle with this car when you're drifting, which is pretty nice. Overall, the KIM Futo for $9,000, you really cannot go wrong with this car. It is pretty much as solid as it gets for drifting, and I mean, being as cheap as it is, it's very, very good. Now, my one complaint with the Futo is it just doesn't have enough power to drift as effectively as I would maybe like it to in GTA. That is kind of a common thing with most of the cars in the game though, so not exactly super ideal, but it is still pretty darn good, I gotta say. Anyway guys, I'm probably gonna get shot for my pick for number 1, but let's move into number 1. Alright guys, at number 1 I've picked the easiest car to drift in Grand Theft Auto Online, and that is of course the Bravado Gauntlet Hellfire. Now I know the JDM guys are screaming and crying right now, I'm very sorry, but the Gauntlet Hellfire is just way too easy to drift. This car is insanely good for drifting in GTA. It takes almost no effort to get this thing to slide, so it's pretty awesome, I gotta say. Now I get that the easiest drift car doesn't necessarily mean it's the best drift car in the game, but I do feel like the Hellfire just drifts so much easier than any car in the game. So for a regular player to go and get a car if they want to drift, I feel like the Gauntlet Hellfire is the best car to pick because it's just so easy to drift this thing. You can basically buy this car, get in it, and just start drifting. It's super, super simple. It's super easy. And the Gauntlet Hellfire, this week, at least when this video is coming out, is on sale, of course, but regularly the car does only cost $745,000, which is not exactly a lot of money in GTA these days. So to get a Hellfire, it is pretty easy, money-wise as well. And then, of course, obviously once you have it, it's just like super easy to drift. You don't really have to put any effort into learning, which definitely for guys that don't want to spend all the time learning how to drift in GTA, the Hellfire is probably the car for you. Overall, I love how this car drives, I love how it handles, it's got great customization that you can do to it. There's really nothing wrong with the Hellfire unless you really like your cars to be grippy around a corner, but if you're watching this video, well, you're obviously trying to learn something about drifting, so I hope you weren't expecting to find cars that handle really well or have like a lot of grip on this list, because that's not what drifting is really for. But anyway guys, the Bravado Gauntlet Hellfire is the car at number 1 on this list, so there you have it. Anyway guys, that is it for the video. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something, a like is of course appreciated, if not dislike. Subscribe if you guys are new, and I will see you all in the next video. Until then, take care. Peace.